We are very delighted, very honored to be hosting Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould. They are a husband and wife team since 1977, journalists, documentary filmmakers. They were the first American journalists in 1981 permitted to enter Afghanistan behind Soviet lines. They have worked for CBS News, they've produced a documentary for PBS, they have appeared on ABC's Nightline. They have produced the documentaries Afghanistan Between Three Worlds and The Woman in Exile Returns, the Seema Wali story. They are the authors of Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, which is published by City Lights. And I'm happy tonight to be celebrating, together with all of you, the release of Crossing Zero, the AfPak War at the Turning Point of American Empire, which is the companion volume to that last book. Also, again, published by City Lights. And it focuses on the Afghanistan-Pakistan strategy and the importance of the border separating Pakistan from Afghanistan, which is often referred to by military strategists as the zero line. So they delve into the nuances of the current situation there. The U.S. involvement is explored in fine detail, and they show us that things are really far more complex than they appear to be. Crossing Zero is a clear, well-researched, and easy-to-read analysis of the spiraling U.S. war in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And it's really essential reading for anyone that's interested in gaining a deeper understanding of the situation, but also really the larger historic context. So please join us in giving them a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter. We want to thank all the cast and crew at City Lights for all the wonderful work that they've done for us over the years, and for publishing our first book, for publishing Crossing Zero, and for all the support that they've given us. They're a wonderful publisher, and I want to thank them tonight. Especially Stacy. When we began our involvement with Afghanistan some 30 years ago, we started by doing a documentary on the nuclear arms race, which was a hotly debated issue at the time. In a documentary titled The Arms Race and the Economy, A Delicate Balance, I asked the question of the famous Keynesian economist John Kenneth Galbraith: at what point does the militarization of the economy actually undermine the interests and the defense of the United States instead of protecting it? Galbraith was emphatic that the proposed military buildup would send the United States hurtling toward that point. But the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan a few months later made any such talk heretical, and to many it still is. Over the last 30 years, we've watched America's involvement in Afghanistan closely as the narrative took shape and then twisted and transformed like the proverbial train wreck in slow motion. All through the 1980s, we observed that killing Russians and holding them in Afghanistan as a payback for the American humiliation in Vietnam was the primary focus of American policy. In the 1990s, we saw the stirring rhetoric and the commitment to the people of Afghanistan of the 1980s evaporate as the country descended into civil war and the rise of the Taliban. When the U.S. invaded and occupied Afghanistan in 2001, we shook our heads at the irony, as the U.S. followed the old Soviet Union into the very same Afghan quagmire that it had used to envelop its enemy. But with the Obama administration's decision to cross over the Durand Line and extend its Afghan war into Pakistan, we knew that the process we had speculated about some 30 years ago had finally been completed. There were two main reasons for naming our new book Crossing Zero. One is that Zero Line is the name given to the Durand Line separating Afghanistan from Pakistan by the military intelligence community. It's also a line that the U.S. has fought on both sides of since the 1980s. The other is that, given its history, Zero Line is an inescapable metaphor for the turning point which the United States finds itself at the beginning of the second decade of the 20th century, fighting a war it is yet to clearly define, yet cannot afford to lose. From the outset, Washington's Afghan problems were threefold. First, there was the absence of an adequate understanding of Afghanistan's history, its people, their needs, and how to provide for them. Prior to the Soviet invasion of 1979, Afghanistan had been one of the poorest countries on earth with a moderate form of Islam. 30 years of war and political instability had reduced Afghanistan to a Stone Age subsistence with its population traumatized, displaced, and occupied by an army of savage religious extremists. In 2001, the solutions appeared simple and straightforward. A few $100 million shrewdly managed and carefully distributed at a grassroots level could have provided a solid foundation for recovery. Instead, the diversion of resources and attention to the war in Iraq and the reimposition of a hated warlord culture allowed Afghanistan to drift toward disaster. After 10 years and hundreds of billions of dollars spent, the Obama administration confronts an absence of governance in much of Afghanistan and Pakistan, the spread of religious violence throughout the region, and the ascent of a narco-funded criminal enterprise global in scope. Washington's second major issue regarding Afghanistan is Pakistan. Originally carved from British India in 1947 with two wings, West Pakistan and East Pakistan, the country has suffered from an identity crisis from its inception. Pakistan's strategic location quickly brought the new country under the folds of the U.S. Cold War umbrella. But instead of putting Pakistan at an advantage, America's embrace had the effect of freezing Afghanistan and Pakistan into a special military relationship that discouraged the nation's democratization and secular development, while at the same time encouraging a radical pan-Islamic movement that now threatens to tear both Pakistan and Afghanistan apart. The current Afghanistan-Pakistan crisis can be traced back to the 19th century, when the British-led Indian Army conquered the part of Afghanistan below the Khyber Pass and forced the partition of Afghanistan into North and South. The drawing of the Durand Line by England's Foreign Secretary for India, Sir Henry Mortimer Durand, in 1893, was intended to guarantee British control of the conquered territory east of the Hindu Kush. It instead proved to be a political albatross and source of constant conflict until the creation of the state of Pakistan in 1947. Pakistan's humiliating defeat in its 1971 war against East Pakistan continues to haunt Pakistan's predominantly Punjabi military establishment. Begun as a Bengali protest for rights and autonomy, the conflict transformed into a war with India, severed East Pakistan from Pakistan, and created the independent nation of Bangladesh. Following the war against the Soviet Union in the 1980s, Pakistan used the Mujahideen and subsequently the Taliban to settle old scores with India and control Afghanistan. But Pakistan's military continues to fear a direct ethnic confrontation with the Pashtun tribes on its western border. This fear makes Pakistan's relationship with the Taliban convoluted and volatile and perhaps unresolvable in any way that is beneficial to the West. Pakistan continues to support elements of the Taliban that carry forward its agenda while making token attacks on those Taliban that do not serve its interests. Although even in this, Pakistan's commitment is not what it seems. While mostly reserving its best-trained military units and expensive high-tech weapons, given to it by the United States, for a potential war with India, Pakistan's military sets the poorly trained and poorly equipped Pashtun Frontier Corps against the Pakistani Taliban. But as the Taliban cells recruit and multiply inside the Punjab, setting up their own Pashtun-controlled Punjabi Taliban among the Punjab's disillusioned youth, a new and dangerous dynamic has taken hold. Washington's third major issue regarding AfPak is Washington itself. The politics of both Afghanistan and Pakistan over the last 60 years have been so entwined in Washington's vast web of special interests that the Obama administration's AfPak policy is actually more about Washington than it is about either country. Burdened by a bureaucratic structure created for a bipolar Cold War, Washington's inability to adjust to a politically complex, multi-ethnic, religiously divided South Asia has hobbled the American effort from the start. By marrying its war on terror to the political agenda of the old Tajik and Uzbek Northern Alliance of the 1990s, it set itself against the political agenda of the traditional rulers of Afghanistan, the Pashtuns, setting the stage for the perpetual conflict it now endures. From a purely American political military perspective, claims that the U.S. is repeating Vietnam are valid. What America did in World War II and Korea, it did in Vietnam, and what it did in Vietnam, it's doing in Afghanistan. But from the perspective of a Taliban or Al-Qaeda fighter or an Afghan elder whose family has been humiliated by a nighttime raid or whose relatives have been struck either accidentally or with intent, the United States is repeating Russia's Vietnam. And that's a distinction that needs to be understood. The Soviet defeat in Afghanistan and the collapse of the Soviet Union filled the Islamic right with messianic fervor. While the United States could walk away from Vietnam, bruised, but with its world status essentially unaffected, the same cannot be said